Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of Behind the Frame, where I'm going to be sharing an image that I took last year on Botswana mobile safari. It's of a wild dog, and it's one that I really like, and I wanted to share the vision behind the photograph with all of you. So I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode of Behind the Frame. So getting into this image, I'll give you a brief look at it. It is of a wild dog. As you can see, it's not really doing too much, but being out in the field, what I thought about this image before I go back is have a look how bright it is behind the wild dog. You can see there's quite a lot of contrast here. The dog's nice and dark. There's a bit of darkness in the foreground. But my idea, also talking to guests out in the field, was, it was mid-morning. The dogs had been out hunting already. We found them. They were playing around a little bit, and then they were kind of just moving around us, sniffing each other, playing with one another. And we got some nice special moments of them interacting, but then we also got some nice images as the rest of the pack were returning to the rest of the wild dogs. And this moment here, this dog was watching two other dogs coming from the distance. So it was a nice moment to capture. In terms of photographing it, what I suggested when we were out in the field is, yes, you can create a nice color image out of it. You would have to play around a little bit with the light and things like that. It wasn't too harsh, but you can see how bright the background is. So my immediate thought with this image was to create a black and white image. And what I like about black and white images, and what is the deciding factor for me, is having a clean background, having lots of contrast, and being able to work those areas to really make your subject pop. Sometimes it comes out a little bit more artistic. And in this case, what I suggested to guests and what I'm going to do today in this edit is create almost a high key image. So I'm going to go through the process with you all of what I'm going to do with the image. So if we have a look here back at the image, normally I would start with a crop. Having a look at this image here, though, now I'm not going to crop it, and the reason being is I like the position of where the wild dog's standing. It's standing facing the right-hand side. So to tell a bit of the story, I mentioned earlier there was two other dogs running in from that side, which caught this dog's attention, and that's why the dog's staring in that direction. It's almost looking in an upward direction, so I've left negative space here for the dog to look into. So in terms of composition, I'm not going to do anything to the crop or change the crop. I'm going to leave it as is. As always, then I go to the basic menu. Having a look at the histogram here, you can see there's one or two relatively high spikes, more on the left-hand side. So my guess is that this, when we do start working with the blacks, is that this area here may be slightly burnt out, but I've got more than enough detail on the rest of the dog in order to really create this image and make it pop and stand out. So we're going to try and work on it a bit. I'm going to go through the basic menu. Typically, I don't like to touch exposure and contrast. What I might do is just bring up exposure slightly as a whole on the image, and automatically you can see now we're thinking about a high key image. We want this area behind the dog to be bright, and just to lighten up the dog a little bit as well, brings out that detail. And then coming down to my favorite sliders, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. What I'm going to do here is hold down Alt, go to the whites, lift whites, and as soon as you start seeing that, you're starting to burn or wash out those white areas. So I'm going to bring it back a little bit. You can already see the brightness now even more intensified behind the animal. And then with the blacks, you can see, okay, I mentioned earlier the ear. If you have a look here, when I press and hold down Alt and try and move the black slider. It's already slightly burnt out. So I'm going to lift shadows slightly. You see what that does. I always recommend what you do when you're playing around with these sliders is that you go opposite ends of the scale. So slider to one side, then slider to the other. It gives you a good idea of what that slider is doing to the image, and then you can find a happy medium as to what you want to do with the image and where you want it to be. So I'm going to lift the shadow slightly here. Goals for me here is just to bring out a bit more detail on the dogs or on the dog, and then possibly lighten up these areas. It is going to be a black and white conversion, as I mentioned. I'm going to come into detail. These adjustments here I don't really touch too much. In terms of masking, we're going to bring it right down. Those white areas are the areas that are going to be affected by these adjustments. As you can see, there are minimum adjustments or minimal adjustments. What I can always do is go and use a mask. And I think that's exactly what I'm going to do in this image, is I'm going to go up to, let me just minimize that, go up to mask, do subject select, does a pretty decent job. If we zoom in, press O for overlay, take that away, you can see it is fairly sharp already. What I am going to do though, it's what I do to most of my images, is just lift the sharpness slightly. That sharpens the entire subject. Then we've got clarity and texture, and the main reason why I use these two is it does also have a sharpening effect, but it's more on the edges of the fur and things like that, not necessarily on my subject as a whole. It also creates a bit of contrast, so you can see there the contrast being created. Obviously both sides of the scale are very much overdone, so I'm just going to lift clarity a bit, texture a bit, and then also having a look at the dog. If we zoom out, what I might do is just to bring out a little bit more detail is lift the shadows here, and then what that allows me to do is to try and keep a bit of contrast. Just a little trick, I've lifted the shadows only on my subject, so that's lifting the dark areas as well. So going back into the image, it allows me now to bring the blacks down slightly, and that just creates that contrast. Now I'm going to go in, and if you have a look at the eye is absolutely beautiful. We've got this nice tint in the eye here, this highlight. What I'm going to do is create another mask and then just go over the eye. And typically, as you've seen, if you have watched previous episodes, what I like to do, just press O for overlay, get rid of that, is just to do a little bit of noise reduction. And it creates that smooth slither across the eye. What I might do is just to bring out that sparkle in the eyes a little bit more is bring up the highlights. You can see if you drag it both sides, that's once again a little bit too extreme, so I'll leave it somewhere here. And then dark areas again, come back to the blacks, bring the blacks down slightly. Press enter, enter, zoom out. And already, I mean, in terms of a color image, it's really, really nice, but we're going to convert it into black and white. So I'm going to press V. Okay, now we're sitting with something like this. And what I'm going to do now is just lift the exposure slightly more. Okay. And I'm going to now, this is really me now nitpicking. So when it comes to images like this, it is a bit more artistic, like I mentioned, but if you have a look at the image and when I go back to the image, you'll see that pretty much from half of the wild dog's body down, there is a bit of shadow. So I'm going to use a brush, and I'm just going to go over the shadowed areas and lift those shadows slightly. It doesn't have to be a drastic change to the shadows, and the reason being is I still want a bit of texture in the image. So I don't just want the dog to be standing randomly with a completely white background. I still want bits and pieces of the foreground, the grass, some of the leaves, just to give an idea of where the dog is actually standing. So what I'm going to do here is go to select a brush. I'm going to create a slightly larger feather, and all we're going to do is we're going to brush over this entire area. Be careful not to go over the dog itself. As you know, the red areas are the areas that I am going to be working on. Do this section here, alongside the body. So I am going fairly quickly, but it's not a big change that I'm going to be making. And you'll see what often goes a long way is just minimal adjustments in creating what you want as the end goal. So my end goal here isn't a color image, it's a high key black and white image. And as you can see, all I've done throughout this editing process is a number of small adjustments on areas that I've noticed that I want to work on. Cover these bits and pieces of grass and leaves, and then simply you've got 3 different options here. So what you can do is you can play with the exposure. You can lift the exposure to brighten up those areas. You can lift the shadows to see if that lightens up the area, or you can also then play with the blacks and lift the blacks. And remember, you only working on those dark areas when you're working with the blacks and the shadows and things, whereas exposure, it's a general overall. Even the light areas are then going to be lightened up as well. So let's start by just lifting the shadows, so even that makes a difference. You see that? And I can maybe do the blacks a little bit, so something like that. Press enter, and I've sit with an image now that looks like this. So it's nice and sharp. What I really like about it is that we've utilized that negative space in the right-hand side of the frame, the direction that the dog's looking. It adds a little bit to the story. What we've done is we've got that nice soft background that was very, very light from the mid-morning light. So we just blew that out slightly more. You can still see a little bit of detail behind. And then what we've done on top of that is we lightened up the dog a little bit, but we also brought down the black slider, which meant that we created a bit of contrast. We also added some sharpness to the dog, some clarity and texture, which also adds contrast and just really makes the dog pop out. And then on top of that, to end it off, what we did is we lightened the foreground. All the shadows that the dog was standing in, we lifted the shadows and we lifted the black slightly in order to make the main point of the image, my subject being the wild dog. And what we've done is we've been able to maintain detail in the image. So you can see where the dog is standing. You can see bits and pieces of grass and leaves here in the foreground. You can see a bit of the background. So it's not completely washed out, but it is a nice high key image. And in terms of editing, there's not much more I would do to the image than what I've done here. As you can see, lots of small adjustments, but I hope that through viewing this edit, you can, when you're out in the field, recognize when the conditions are suitable to create a high key image. So remember, especially if you're out all day, wherever it may be, on safari, as the mornings get on, the light becomes quite harsh, so you do get a lot of contrast. Same as when you head out in the afternoon, that first period of afternoon drive, the light can be quite harsh, so it creates a good mindset for you to have to think about black and white pictures. And images like this can be thought about before you've even lifted your camera. So I hope that these little tricks and bits of information that I've shared with you help you in editing your images into black and white and converting them into black and white images and creating high key images. So I hope that you really, really enjoyed this edit. I always enjoy editing high key images and black and white images like this. So yeah, I hope that you're able to take some information away from this and enjoy the edit just as much as I did. Thank you all for tuning in, and until next time, I'm going to say cheers.